And welcome back. We're now going to go ahead and talk about rethrowing exception because there are going to be times when we have to, for example, have an exception be able to have some sort of clause where we may need to have a catch statement that has its own kind of exception being thrown. And to start us off, before we jump right into dealing with this, let's first talk about two things that are going to be kind of important to understand, which is first off is the assertion error class. When we discussed the assert operator in assertion checking, we have said that, well, your program, if it contains an assertion check and that assertion check fails, your program should end with an error message. But what happens is that an object of that class, assertion error, is technically thrown. And if it's not caught within a catch block, your program is going to end with an error message. However, of course, if you wish, you don't have to have it end with the error message. Instead, you can catch that with another catch block, although that's not technically a very common thing to do. The assertion error class is in the Java Lang package, so you don't have to import it. As the name suggests, the class assertion error is derived from the class error, so you're not required to either catch it or in a catch block or declare it in a throws clause. Because remember, error classes are not the same as with the exceptions. The other thing we're going to look at is the array index out of bounds exception. If your program attempts to use an array index that is out of bounds, an array index out of bounds exception is thrown and your program ends, unless that exception is caught in a catch block. Array index out of bounds exception, of course, is a descendant of the class runtime exception, and so kind of like before, we don't have to have it caught or be accounted for with a throws clause. This sort of exception normally indicates there is something wrong with your code. It means that you need to fix it and not necessarily catch an exception. Thus, array index out of bounds normally functions much more like a runtime error than a regular exception that we would handle. Array index out of bounds exception is again in the standard Java libraries, so you don't need a import statement should you decide to actually use it. And so this is ultimately leading us to the fact that exceptions may be thrown inside of the catch block. A catch block can contain code that throws an exception. Might seem a little counterintuitive, but it can throw an exception in there. In rare cases, you may actually find it useful to catch an exception, and then depending on the string produced, for example, by getMessage, or depending on some other scenario, you may decide to throw either the same or a different exception for handling things further up the chain of exception blocks. And so here I have a quick code that is going to go ahead and test out what this looks like. And so if we look, here is our main method, and so I am having it throw the throwable clause here, so we have a throws exception. And of course, if you look at our try block, it's calling the method test2. It has a catch with exception E, and it says caught in the main. We have test1, which throws the exception, and what it's going to do is just as this print method, and then throws a new exception. And then, of course, test2, which is what is actually invoked in main. You see it has throws throwable. We have our try of test1, and we have our catch block right here, which is inside test2. And of course, that will also throw. And of course, this throw E right here is referring to the ability to have this kind of rethrown exception. And if I run my code, we get the exception in test1 method. Exception test1 method, of course, you can see is right here, because how does this program work? Well, it invokes test2, but what's inside of test2 is an invocation of test1. So it's going to go ahead and print out that statement. Then we get the inside test2 method, which if you look, that is right here with this catch statement. Because what does test1 do? Well, it throws a new exception. That exception is then caught by test2, and then you can see it says throw E. Throw E then is what is caught back into the main method, so this is where that exception is handled, and you can see that it now says caught in main. So this might seem a little confusing, but there are sometimes specific cases when you want to have these handled. And this is a very simple example in terms of presentation, but ultimately it is possible for us to do it. Now, there might be times you say, well, do I really need to handle this way? Maybe you just need to rewrite your code. Maybe you need to revisit it to have a better algorithm, for example, so that you don't have to rethrow an exception. But again, there are going to be times when it is necessary to rethrow an exception, and you just need to make sure from your end that you have your code set up in a way that is going to be able to handle that and not produce unexpected events.